Without objection.
Mr. President, there's often kind of a casual debate about regulation and the power of government. And some basically start with the premise that all regulation is bad, eliminating regulation is always good, and that the role of the government needs to be challenged and questioned regularly. I guess there's some truth in those statements, but there comes a moment when we put things in perspective. And let me tell you, the people who live in the community of Willowbrook in Illinois are putting things in perspective when it comes to regulation. Most people are not familiar with Willowbrook. It's a village west of Chicago, population 9,000. It's in DuPage County, just west of the downtown Chicago area. It's a middle-income community with a lot of hardworking families, and many of them work hard to make sure their kids have a better life than they do, as so many American families do. In the middle of this village of Willowbrook is a business known as Sterigenics. It is a sterilization plant that uses a chemical, ethylene oxide, to sterilize medical equipment. And they do it in great volume. On any given day, they'll be sterilizing thousands of catheters that are being used across the country and certainly in the Midwest for stents and for investigative medicine, absolutely essential to the health of those who are being treated. They'll approve over 1,000 surgical kits each day through their sterilization process. They put through the sterilization process such things as knee replacements, defibrillating devices that are implanted in persons. So it is an essential part of the medical picture in the Midwest at this moment. But it also turns out that the chemical that they are using, ethylene oxide, is problematic. And that's where the issue of government regulation becomes front and center. I didn't know much about ethylene oxide. I'm a liberal arts lawyer, so I skipped all those hard chemistry courses and tried to understand other aspects of education. And so when it came to ethylene oxide, I needed to be educated. Here's what we found. We've learned that ethylene oxide is a dangerous toxin. It's carcinogenic. To put it in layman's terms, it causes cancer. We learned that ethylene oxide, a chemical in the form of gas, is more carcinogenic to humans than we previously thought. And this facility has been releasing ethylene oxide into the surrounding Willowbrook community for 34 years. Then we found out last August that Willowbrook, this community, is an area with higher cancer risk due to ethylene oxide emissions from Sterigenics. And we know that cancer related to ethylene oxide exposure includes lymphoid cancers, breast cancer, stomach cancer, and others. After we were told that this company, Sterigenics, was doing everything it could to reduce the emissions of this carcinogenic toxic gas and that it had installed pollution control measures, a local television station, CBS in Chicago, revealed a few days ago through interviews that that wasn't the story at all. Ex-employees of Sterigenics came forward and reported to this television station that ethylene oxide was often released directly into the air surrounding the plant through open doors and vents, that instead of being directed through pollution control measures, it was simply released. Employees were instructed at Sterigenics, according to these whistleblowers, to dump a toxic liquid byproduct of ethylene oxide called ethylene glycol directly into the water drains that lead to the public sewer system. Ethylene glycol is a chemical that's used in antifreeze. And then in the middle of last week came a stunning revelation. We were told by the Environmental Protection Agency, an agency that is often derided here in Washington by many. We were told by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency that the level of ethylene oxide measured outside the Sterigenics facility in Willowbrook, Illinois, was 350 times higher than what the EPA finds to be an acceptable risk, and 50 times higher than what was found in the surrounding area. Saying that the families, some of whom have lived in Willowbrook for decades, are concerned is a dramatic understatement. Imagine, if you will, for a moment, that you have been raising a child in Willowbrook, that your family has lived within sight of this Sterigenics plant, and now you learn that they are releasing this toxic gas into the air at a level 350 times beyond what is deemed acceptable for human exposure. To say that the residents are concerned is a dramatic understatement. They are demanding action, and they want answers. And for the record, Mr. President, this is not about Democrats making noise. This is a bipartisan response. Dan Cronin is a friend of mine. He's the chairman of the county board in DuPage County, a proud Republican. Both he and Jim Durkin, who is the Republican leader of the Illinois House, have come out publicly with the strongest possible statements about this Sterigenics mission and the danger it poses to their community. The same thing is true for the Democratic side of public service in that county. All of us have come out together, Democrats and Republicans, decrying this terrible situation, this dangerous situation. Members of this community should not have to divert time away from their lives and their loved ones to try to research a chemical release and to piece together answers. That is the responsibility of the United States Environmental Protection Agency, an agency which sadly under this administration has been led by people who don't have a sympathy for families before business. They tend to lean toward the business side before they look at the public health aspect. That's unfortunate. The Clean Air Act was one of the first and most expansive environmental laws ever created in the United States. But as with most laws, the Clean Air Act is enforced by a federal agency, in this case the Environmental Protection Agency, with broad power and authority to act or to refuse to act. In this case, the Environmental Protection Agency has the authority to use the new information that came off their own monitors, new information about the concentrations and danger of ethylene oxide, to develop new rules around the use of that chemical, including when it is used for commercial sterilization in plants like Sterigenics. EPA has the authority to do this. The EPA should quickly promulgate rules to establish safe limits for ethylene oxide used in manufacturing and commercial sterilization. This would not only protect the people of Willowbrook, but also the people of Gurnee and Waukegan, Illinois, who also have plants that use ethylene oxide, plants that are located smack dab in the middle of these populated communities. Under the Clean Air Act, the EPA is 4 years overdue to begin the process of promulgating new rules for ethylene oxide commercial sterilization. And yet, when I called the acting administrator, Mr. Wheeler of EPA, last Friday, there doesn't seem to be any sense of urgency to take action on this issue beyond the further collection of data over the next several weeks. The EPA is under court order to review ethylene oxide emission standards for manufacturing by 2020, but there is no official timeline for commercial sterilization review, exactly what we have asked of Mr. Wheeler and the EPA over and over again. Waiting a year is unacceptable for the families that are affected by these emissions. The health and safety of these families and their children is at stake in this decision by the US EPA. It is too long to ask someone to wait when they sleep near this plant, work near this plant, or take their kids to school near this plant. That is why today I've joined my colleague, Senator Duckworth, who has been my trusted ally in this effort, and my colleagues in the House of Representatives, Congressman Schneider, Foster, Kasten, and Lipinski. We're introducing legislation requiring the EPA to promulgate these rules within 180 days on the use of ethylene oxide in this manner. There is no excuse. There is no logical explanation for delaying this kind of establishment of a rule. But the EPA has to do a lot more than simply start a 6-month process toward promulgating a rule on ethylene oxide. The EPA needs to treat this matter like the public health crisis that it is. Senator Duckworth and I are calling today on the EPA to immediately require Sterigenics to work with an independent third-party environmental engineering firm to identify the source of these emissions and reduce these emissions coming from this facility. We want a third party on the scene. We don't trust Sterigenics to do this by themselves, and for their own credibility, they should invite a credible third-party environmental engineering firm to do this work. If Sterigenics cares about this community as much as they say they do, they shouldn't wait for the EPA to issue an order for them to have this sort of inspection and to make the repairs and changes necessary to protect the people in the surrounding community. They should immediately hire an independent third-party expert to identify the source of emissions and reduce them as quickly as humanly possible. The EPA should commit to continuous monitoring around the facility instead of ending the monitoring as planned at the end of this week. The EPA should remain as a presence in this community to make sure we restore the faith in the people living nearby that the situation is no longer dangerous and threatening. And the EPA should commit to continuing to analyze and share the data they collect with the public. No one should have to live in fear that simply breathing the air around their home, their school, or the workplace will give them cancer. I'm calling on the EPA to treat this with the urgency it deserves. I'm ready to work with them, and I'm sure Senator Duckworth is as well. And let me close by saying there are many people who mock the EPA, say we'd be better off if they stopped harassing businesses like Sterigenics. Tell that to the people who live in Willowbrook. Tell that to the people who live in Gurnee or Waukegan. They are counting on us, those of us in Washington who work with the Environmental Protection Agency, to keep this community safe for their family. They are counting on us to understand the concern that they feel for themselves and their children. And they're counting on us not to come up with bureaucratic delay, but to come up with a timely response, to put Sterigenics on the spot when it comes to the emissions that are coming off their plant, and to put us as a government on the spot to respond as quickly as legally and humanly possible. It isn't a matter of bureaucracy. It is a matter of common sense. If this were your family living next to this facility, would you want business as usual? Would you want to make sure that the government responds in a timely fashion? I think the answer is obvious. Mr. President, I yield the floor.